Hi, David from Pavilion. Pavilion is a specialist in providing branded promotional products which are sustainable. The most common question we're asked, of course, is what's the most sustainable branded product and how would you measure that? And that's a difficult question and often comes with hesitations. Why? This video aims to try and explain eco-credentials, particularly for promotional merchandise, and how you might compare them. The first problem you've got, of course, is that you're comparing different materials. I'm going to use in this video the example of a t-shirt, but even t-shirts are made of different materials, and you've got to try and compare one material with another. The reason for this is why it's difficult is because there's no true standard of sustainability. There is no international marking that says this one's a 10 and this one's a 1. The nearest you have is carbon footprint, which is a measure. Carbon footprint generally means the amount of carbon dioxide measured in kilos, but you've got to be a bit careful with that, particularly for promotional merchandise, because carbon dioxide is not the only greenhouse gas. You may be fully aware that methane, particularly natural gas, has a global warming effect, which is 50 to 60 times more than CO2. So you don't need to measure just CO2, you've really got to look at a CO2 equivalent, in other words, converting the methane. And why do I mention that? Promotional merchandise is printed, it can be printed, it could be embroidered, but if it's printed, yes, you could be using water-based inks, but you might be using inks based with solvents, and therefore CO2 equivalent is what you need to measure. The next problem that you've got is what are you measuring the carbon footprint of? Are we talking what's termed cradle to grave or cradle to gate? What the hell do I mean by that? The concept being that we can look at where the materials originally come from and we can trace them through the processing, the printing, the manufacturing and the shipping to us, to our warehouse, the cradle to gate. And Pavilion will have that information. We'll be able to give you a CO2 equivalent very often for a cradle to gate. The difficulty we've got in promotional merchandise, of course, is we don't know what happens to them next, depending upon how they're shipped and where they're used. And more importantly, what happens at the end of the life. As I say, I'm going to use a t-shirt as my example in a moment. But the question is, once you've given that t-shirt to the end user, what are they going to do with it? Are they just going to throw it away, or are they going to try and recycle it? So we'll never actually know the true CO2 equivalent cradle to grave, but we can work on the cradle to gate. Let's take the example. So here we are. The first one, it's a 100% polyester t-shirt. It's a sports t-shirt, and the footprint is 2.096 kilos CO2 equivalent, which probably doesn't mean anything to anybody, only in the sense that we can use this as a comparison to other items. I said there it's unlikely to be recycled in the UK, and that's the idea of cradle to grave. If a user has one of these, it's unlikely that polyester would be recycled from a t-shirt. Polyester is recyclable, but if you haven't got the collection systems certainly within the UK, then it's highly unlikely it'll ever get recycled. But you can recycle polyester, as I say. Most recycled polyester comes from polyester bottles, your large Coke bottle, which are collected, ground, and turned into fibre to produce a recycled polyester, which is a nice material. You wouldn't know the difference with a virgin polyester. But look at what happens to the footprint. The footprint goes down by about 25%, 2 kilos to 1.4. But again, you would have the issue of it not being able to be recycled, typically within the standard waste streams. Let's look at another material. Cotton. Standard 100% cotton. And you can see we've already dropped another 10%, 20%-ish, by just moving to a cotton rather than a polyester, even the recycled polyester. And the advantage of cotton is that it is readily recyclable. They can be collected. They are collected cotton materials and they are recycled very often. I say very often because we don't know what the end user is going to do with them. They may just throw it in the wrong bin and it might end up in landfill. There are other cottons though. Here's the organic cotton. So what's organic cotton? Organic cotton is still a natural plant which is farmed, but organic cotton is grown with a lot less water and a lot less pesticides and herbicides. The consequent effect of that is to bring down the footprint even further. We're now at 0.9 CO2 equivalent. And again, that organic cotton would be readily recyclable. I tried to find 100% cotton recycled material, in other words, a t-shirt made from recycled cotton. Couldn't find one anywhere within the world of branded merchandise. The nearest I got was this one, which is 50% recycled cotton and 50% polyester, which again is very low. The difficulty with going for a blend, and that's why I mentioned it, is that blends are very difficult to recycle because, of course, they are a blend, and therefore removing one material from another is very difficult. I've just thrown out an awful lot of numbers there. Let me put them all on a table so that you can see them. So there they are. As I say, 2.096 kilos doesn't mean anything to anybody, but it does when you start to compare them. And lo and behold, there you go. The 100% organic cotton, certainly from the ones that I was looking at, was the lowest CO2 equivalent. But the other thing to take into account is, can it be recycled at the end of its life? Now, in the case of cottons, yes, they can. But if I'd have been doing this exercise not on t-shirts, but on pens, notebooks, bottles, then we may have got a different answer. In other words, we could have got a very low carbon footprint equivalent, but it couldn't be recycled. And it's very difficult to measure one against another. So what's the conclusion? Obviously, organic cotton in this case was the most sustainable for a t-shirt. But like I say, whilst t-shirts can be compared, other products are not quite so easy, particularly because of this issue of what happens at the end of life and the ability to recycle. There's another thing to bear in mind. This is all dependent upon weight. I could have distorted all of the numbers. I actually chose t-shirts quite deliberately, which were of a similar quality, the same weight of cottons. For example, if I'd have chosen a very lightweight cotton, I could have actually brought that number way, way down, but I'm cheating because all I'm doing really is reducing the amount of material that's there rather than comparing materials. And just to complicate things even more, polyesters are usually really quite light for the same quality of t-shirt. Yeah, complicated. And it's not only complicated, but if you come to us and ask us for the CO2 equivalent, most of the time we can do that, but I am actually reliant on information from the manufacturers within the supply chain. So not all companies produce that. Yeah. I hope you found that useful in the sense of trying to convey the complexities of measuring what's the most sustainable. I guess the only thing I would say is, if you're thinking about branded merchandise and eco-branded merchandise, let's talk. Thank you very much.